Imagine walking down the street, penniless, struggling to survive, and suddenly you notice an old man collapsed on the sidewalk. No one stops, no one cares, but you do. You kneel, offer a hand, and in that moment, nothing will ever be the same. This isn't just a story of chance. It's the story of Elijah, a poor black man whose single act of kindness completely changed the life of Richard Hale, a billionaire who had everything except purpose. Richard had built his empire on power, money, and control, yet despite all his wealth, he was alone, cold, and empty inside. Every boardroom victory, every deal, every luxurious purchase had left him feeling hollow. Then Elijah appeared, a man with nothing, offering everything, a simple act of care. And suddenly, Richard's world shifted. Suddenly, he realized that money couldn't buy what he truly needed: connection, meaning, and hope. But this story isn't just about a billionaire being saved. It's about what happens when someone gives without expecting anything in return. The ripple effects: life-changing, heart-wrenching, and utterly unforgettable. Stick with me, because in the next few minutes you'll see how a poor man helped a lonely billionaire rediscover purpose, how small acts can ignite monumental change, and how one decision, one simple choice, can alter destiny forever. By the end of this video, you'll never look at kindness the same way again, and you might just feel inspired to change someone's life today. Welcome to BrainFuel, the channel that fuels your mind with unbelievable stories, life-changing lessons, and real moments that inspire. Here, every story is designed to make you think, feel, and grow. Get ready to unlock the power of human courage, kindness, and resilience. Stop! The sharp sound of a body hitting the cold sidewalk cut through the noise of the busy street. Cars slowed, voices stopped, even the city itself seemed to hold its breath. An old man in a perfectly tailored suit lay stretched across the pavement, his cane rolling away from his trembling hand. Is that Richard Hale?" someone whispered, fearful disbelief. Heads turned, eyes widened, phones were lifted halfway, then slowly lowered, confused hesitation. Everyone knew that name: Richard Hale, the billionaire who owned half the city, the man whose shadow controlled jobs, buildings, and lives. He was never weak, never helpless, never on the ground like this, unbelieving stares. Richard's chest rose and fell unevenly. His breath came in short, broken gasps, labored breathing. His face, once always calm and powerful, was pale and wet with sweat, visible distress. He tried to speak, but only a faint sound escaped his lips, trembling voice. People formed a circle around him, but no one stepped closer, nervous distance. Some looked worried, some looked curious, others looked afraid of getting involved, inner conflict. "Someone call an ambulance!" a man shouted. Urgent panic. "I think his security is coming," another said, backing away, avoiding responsibility. Seconds passed, long, heavy seconds, rising tension. Richard's fingers curled weakly against the ground. His eyes searched the faces above him, faces that had once bowed, smiled, begged, and obeyed. Desperate search. Now they only stared. In that moment, surrounded by people, Richard Hale had never felt more alone. Overwhelming isolation. Then a voice broke through the silence. "Move, please move." A poor black man pushed through the crowd, holding a small paper bag with bread and fruit inside, determined action. His clothes were worn, his shoes were cracked, but his eyes were focused and calm, steady resolve. His name was Elijah. "Sir, can you hear me?" Elijah asked, as he dropped to his knees beside the old man, calm but urgent. A woman grabbed Elijah's arm. "Don't touch him, you'll get in trouble," she warned. Fearful warning. Elijah gently pulled his arm free, quiet determination. "He needs help," he said simply, confident and strong. Richard's eyes shifted toward Elijah. For a second, they locked. Weak awareness. He tried to speak again. "Water," he whispered, faint plea. Elijah opened his bag, pulled out a bottle meant for himself, and carefully lifted Richard's head, caring action. He placed his own jacket under the old man's neck to keep his head from the cold ground. Selfless gesture. "Slow breaths," Elijah said softly, soothing voice. "I'm here. You're safe." Those words hit Richard harder than the pain in his chest. Emotional shock. Safe. It was a word he hadn't felt in years. Around them, the crowd watched in stunned silence, awed stillness. The man kneeling on the ground had nothing, no title, no power, no money, yet he was the only one acting. Unexpected heroism. A security guard finally pushed through the crowd. "Sir, sir," he shouted, kneeling beside Richard. Panicked reaction. Richard's weak hand tightened around Elijah's sleeve instead. Desperate grip. "Don't go," Richard whispered, trembling fear. Elijah met the security's eyes. "Let me stay until help arrives," he said firmly, protective tone. Sirens wailed in the distance, growing louder with every second, rising relief. Richard's breathing was still uneven, but his eyes stayed fixed on Elijah's face, clinging hope. "Why?" Richard struggled to speak, each word heavy. Physical strain. "Why are you helping me?" Elijah didn't answer right away. He wiped sweat from Richard's forehead with his sleeve, gentle care. "Because you're human," he said finally, sincere honesty. Richard's eyes filled with tears he didn't understand, emotional break. For decades, people had treated him like a god or a monster, never just a human. Painful realization. The ambulance screeched to a stop. Paramedics rushed forward. Urgent movement. As they lifted Richard onto the stretcher, his grip on Elijah tightened again, fear of letting go. "Please," Richard whispered, weak desperation. "I'm not leaving," Elijah said, reassuring promise. As the ambulance doors closed, Richard looked at Elijah one last time, searching gaze. In that single moment, lying between life and death, surrounded by wealth yet saved by poverty, something deep inside him cracked open, life-changing realization. The city noise returned, cars moved again, people walked away. Normalcy resumes. But for Richard Hale, the world would never be the same again. Fateful turn. The ambulance doors slammed shut with a sharp metallic sound. The siren screamed as the vehicle pulled away, cutting through traffic like a cry for help that refused to be ignored. Elijah stood on the sidewalk, chest rising and falling fast, watching the red lights disappear into the distance. For a moment, he felt the weight of everything he had just done. His hands were still shaking, his jacket was gone, his food bag was empty, but none of that mattered now. People slowly began to move again. Some avoided Elijah's eyes, others stared at him with confusion and quiet respect. A man muttered, "That was Richard Hale." Another replied, "Never thought I'd see him like that." Elijah turned away and started walking. He didn't wait for praise, he didn't expect thanks. To him, it was just another human moment in a hard world. But inside the ambulance, everything was different. Richard lay strapped to the stretcher, oxygen mask pressed to his face. The flashing lights reflected off the ceiling as his heart monitor beeped unevenly. His mind drifted in and out, slipping between consciousness and darkness. Every time his eyes opened, he saw Elijah's face, calm, focused, kind, a face that did not want anything from him. Who was that man?" Richard whispered through the mask. One of the paramedics leaned closer. "The one who stayed with you?" "We don't know, sir." Richard closed his eyes. Not knowing his name felt strange. His whole life people chased him, begged him, feared him, and now the one person who saved him was someone he knew nothing about. At the hospital entrance, doctors rushed in as the stretcher rolled through bright white halls. Orders were shouted, machines beeped louder. "Blood pressure dropping! Prepare the ER!" Richard tried to speak again, panic rising in his chest. The man from outside!" But the words disappeared as darkness pulled him under. Hours later, silence replaced the noise. Richard's eyes slowly opened. The ceiling above him was unfamiliar. The air smelled clean and cold. A steady beep echoed nearby. "You're awake," a nurse said softly from the side of the bed. Richard tried to move but winced. "Where am I?" "You're in the hospital. You had a serious episode, but you're stable now." His memory rushed back all at once. The street, the ground, the pain, the faces, and then Elijah. "The man," Richard said urgently. "Where is he?" The nurse paused, surprised. "The man who helped you?" "Yes," Richard said, voice still weak but firm. "He left after the ambulance arrived," she replied. Something heavy settled in Richard's chest. He turned his head slowly towards the window. Outside, life continued as if nothing had happened. For the first time in years, Richard felt small. A doctor entered the room, flipping through a chart. "You were lucky," he said honestly. "If help hadn't come when it did, the outcome could have been very different." Richard swallowed hard. Lucky, the word echoed painfully. He had built his life on control, planning, and power. Luck was something he never believed in. "Someone stayed with me," Richard said quietly. "Yes," the doctor nodded. That made all the difference. After the doctor left, the room felt empty despite the machines. Richard stared at his hands. They were old, thin, weak. These hands had signed deals worth billions, yet today they couldn't even hold themselves up. Memories began to surface. Boardrooms filled with applause that felt hollow. Lavish parties where laughter died the moment he left the room. Family dinners that ended in silence. He felt a tightness in his throat. A nurse returned to adjust his IV. "You're doing okay," she said kindly. Richard nodded but said nothing. He wasn't sure if okay meant alive or still empty. Later that evening, his security team arrived. They spoke in low voices, apologizing, explaining delays. Richard listened without reacting. His mind was elsewhere. "Find the man," Richard said suddenly. The room fell quiet. "The man who helped me on the street," he clarified. "Yes, sir," the head of security replied immediately. As they left, Richard closed his eyes again. But this time, the darkness felt different. It wasn't empty. It was full of questions. Who was Elijah? Why did he stay? Why did his simple words feel heavier than years of praise? Somewhere deep inside, a quiet realization began to grow. For the first time in decades, Richard Hale was not thinking about money, power, or legacy. He was thinking about kindness and why it had taken a stranger with nothing to show him its value. Morning light slipped through the thin hospital curtains, pale and quiet, touching Richard Hale's face as he slowly woke again. The steady beep of machines filled the room like a reminder that he was still here. His chest felt tight, his body heavy, as if the weight of his entire life rested on his bones. He turned his head slightly and winced. The events of the previous day returned in pieces: the street, the fall, the fear, and then that voice. "You're not alone. I'm here." Richard closed his eyes tightly. Those words echoed louder than the machines around him. A nurse entered quietly, checking monitors and writing notes. "Good morning, Mr. Hale," she said softly. "How are you feeling?" Richard hesitated before answering. "Alive," he said finally. She smiled gently. "That's a good start." As she adjusted the bed, Richard watched her movements. He noticed something strange. She wasn't nervous around him. No forced smile, no fear, just calm. "Can I ask you something?" Richard said. "Of course," she replied. "The man who stayed with me, did anyone find him?" The nurse paused, thinking. Security asked around, but he left before giving his name. Richard's fingers curled slowly against the blanket. He nodded, pretending it didn't matter. After she left, the room felt too big and too quiet. Richard stared at the ceiling again. For the first time, silence didn't feel peaceful. It felt loud. A knock came at the door. 2 men in suits stepped inside, his legal advisor and head of security. "Sir," the advisor began, "we've handled the media. The incident won't affect the company." Richard didn't respond right away. "We also increased your personal security," the guard added. Richard slowly turned his head toward them. "Did anyone thank the man who helped me?" he asked. The men exchanged a quick glance. "We don't know who he was," the guard admitted. Richard exhaled sharply. Figures. They waited for further instructions. "Leave us," Richard said quietly. As the door closed, Richard felt something shift inside his chest, not pain, but pressure. He reached for the call button. "Nurse," he said when she answered, "if that man comes back, please send him in." She nodded with a soft smile. Hours passed. Doctors came and went. Tests were run. Numbers were discussed. Richard answered questions but barely listened. Then, late in the afternoon, footsteps paused outside his door. A familiar, calm voice spoke quietly to the nurse. Richard's heart skipped. The door opened slowly. Elijah stepped inside. He looked uncomfortable in the clean white hallway light. His clothes were the same worn ones from the street. His hands were folded in front of him, unsure where to rest. Richard stared at him, unable to speak at first. "You asked to see me," Elijah said softly. Richard swallowed hard. "You came," he whispered. Elijah nodded. "The nurse said you wanted to talk." For a moment, neither of them spoke. The room seemed to shrink, holding only the 2 of them and everything unsaid. "Sit," Richard said, gesturing weakly to the chair beside the bed. Elijah hesitated, then sat carefully. "I didn't get to thank you," Richard said. His voice cracked slightly. "You saved my life." Elijah shook his head gently. "I just stayed," he said. "That was enough," Richard replied. Richard studied Elijah's face, the lines of tiredness, the calm eyes, the lack of fear. "Most people ran," Richard said. Elijah looked down for a moment. "People are scared," he said. "Sometimes of you, sometimes of the world." Richard closed his eyes briefly. "Why weren't you scared?" Richard asked. Elijah took a slow breath. "Because I know what it feels like to be on the ground," he said. Richard's chest tightened. "I lost everything once," Elijah continued. "Health, family, pride. When I fell, most people looked away." He looked up at Richard again. "I promised myself I wouldn't be one of them." Richard felt his eyes burn. "I've been surrounded by people my whole life," Richard said slowly, "and I've never felt so alone as I did yesterday." Elijah nodded once. "I want to help you," Richard said suddenly. "Money, work, anything you need." Elijah met his eyes calmly. "I didn't come for that," he said. Richard flinched. "I came because you asked," Elijah added. The words landed heavily in the room. For the first time, Richard understood something he had avoided his entire life. Not everything could be bought. Not everyone wanted something from him. As Elijah stood to leave, Richard spoke again. "Stay," he said quietly. "Just talk to me." Elijah paused, then sat back down. And in that simple act, something inside Richard Hale began to change, not loudly, not suddenly, but deeply. The night settled heavily over the hospital, pressing against the windows like a quiet reminder of time passing. Richard Hale lay awake again, the room dim except for the soft green glow of monitors. The sounds of distant footsteps and rolling carts echoed faintly down the hallway. He should have been tired. His body was weak, his heart strained, but his mind refused to rest. Elijah's words replayed over and over. "Don't use money to end the conversation." Richard stared at the ceiling, jaw tightening. For decades, money had ended every conversation he didn't want to have. Arguments, guilt, responsibility. A check here, a gift there, silence bought and paid for. Now, lying alone in a hospital bed, that silence felt unbearable. He turned his head slightly, wincing, and pressed the call button. A nurse appeared a few moments later. "Everything okay, Mr. Hale?" she asked, concerned. "I can't sleep," Richard admitted, honest weakness. She nodded with understanding. "That happens after something like this." "Can you sit for a minute?" he asked, surprising himself. The nurse hesitated, then pulled a chair closer. They sat in silence for a few seconds. Awkward pause. Richard felt strangely exposed, vulnerable feeling. "I almost died," he said suddenly, blunt confession. "Yes," she replied softly, calm acknowledgement. "And the only person who stayed with me was someone I've never met before," Richard continued, shaken voice. The nurse listened carefully, attentive silence. "I don't understand why," he said, confused pain. She considered her words, thoughtful pause. "Some people help because they know what it feels like not to be helped," she said gently. Simple wisdom. Richard closed his eyes, emotional weight. When the nurse left, the room felt different, less empty, but heavier with truth, lingering impact. Sleep came in short, broken pieces, fragmented rest. In one dream, Richard stood in a vast boardroom alone. Chairs were empty, papers lay untouched. His voice echoed when he spoke, but no one answered. Abandonment. He woke with a sharp breath, startled wake. His heart pounded, not from fear, but from recognition, painful clarity. Morning arrived slowly. Soft sunlight crept across the floor as Richard sat propped up against pillows, weary posture. A doctor entered with a clipboard. "Your condition is stable," he said, measured assurance. "But stress will slow your recovery." Richard almost laughed, bitter amusement. "Then you'll need to change how you live," the doctor added, direct advice. Richard nodded quietly, sober acceptance. After the doctor left, Richard stared at his hands again, introspective pause. These hands had controlled empires, but not this, humbling truth. Later that morning, the door opened softly, gentle entry. Elijah stepped inside, carrying nothing this time, modest arrival. Richard felt something ease in his chest at the sight of him, relief. "You came," he said, quiet gratitude. Elijah nodded. "You looked like someone who wouldn't sleep," he replied, a knowing tone. Richard gave a weak smile, tired humor. "I didn't." Elijah pulled the chair closer and sat, easy presence. "I kept thinking last night, Richard began, reflective opening. About what you said, about choosing one small thing. Elijah listened, patient attention. I don't know where to start, Richard admitted, vulnerable confession. Elijah leaned forward slightly, engaged posture. Start with truth, he said, steady advice. Truth? Richard echoed, uncertain. Yes, Elijah replied, about why you're really helping. Richard swallowed hard, emotional tightness. For years, Richard said slowly, careful words, I told myself I was building something that would last, legacy, impact. His voice wavered, cracking pride. But I think I was just trying to outrun being alone. Elijah didn't interrupt, respectful silence. I didn't help people, Richard continued, low shame. I invested in them. There was always a return. He looked directly at Elijah, steady gaze. There's no return with you. Elijah nodded, quiet agreement. And that scares me, Richard admitted, raw honesty. That's okay, Elijah said, calm acceptance. Richard exhaled slowly, released breath. I want to do something real, Richard said, resolute intent. Elijah considered this, thoughtful silence. Then don't announce it, Elijah replied, practical wisdom. Richard nodded, growing understanding. There's a community kitchen I help at. They need supplies, volunteers, consistency. Richard listened carefully, focused attention. I can arrange that, Richard said automatically, then stopped himself. No, I can show up. Elijah's eyes lifted slightly, quiet surprise. Not today, Richard added, realistic limit, but when I'm out of here. Elijah studied him, measuring trust. Showing up once is easy, he said, caution. Showing up again is the work. Richard nodded firmly, steadfast commitment. Then I'll do the work. Silence settled between them again, shared stillness. You don't owe me this, Elijah said, clear boundary. I know, Richard replied, sincere acknowledgement. That's why it matters. Later, when Elijah stood to leave, Richard felt the familiar urge to promise too much. He stopped himself. Discipline. Thank you, he said, simply, pure gratitude. Elijah smiled faintly, quiet approval. After the door closed, soft finality, Richard lay back and closed his eyes, settling. For the first time, his future didn't feel like something to manage or control, shifted perspective. It felt like something to face, honestly, slowly, and without hiding, new resolve. The room settled into a quiet that felt different from before, less empty, more alive. Richard watched Elijah sit back down, the chair creaking softly under his weight. The machines kept their steady rhythm, but Richard's breathing slowly matched it. Tell me about yourself, Richard said at last. His voice carried none of its old command, only curiosity. Elijah hesitated, eyes dropping to his hands. There's not much to tell, he said. I want to hear it, Richard replied. Elijah nodded slowly. I grew up not far from here, he began. My mother worked 2 jobs. My father left early. His voice stayed steady, but his jaw tightened slightly. I learned young how to stay out of the way. Richard listened without interrupting. I worked construction, Elijah continued. Then a fall, bad one. He touched his knee lightly. Medical bills came fast. Job disappeared faster. Richard felt a knot tighten in his chest. He had approved budgets larger than Elijah's lifetime costs without a thought. "I slept in shelters for a while," Elijah said. "Some nights the street." He glanced toward the window. "You learn what matters when you're cold." "What matters?" Richard asked. "Who looks at you?" Elijah answered. "And who doesn't?" The words landed like a weight. Richard swallowed hard. "I didn't look," Richard said, barely above a whisper. Elijah met his eyes. "Most people don't," he replied. "It's easier." Silence returned, but it was not awkward. Richard stared at the ceiling again. "I built my life on being untouchable," Richard said. "If people needed me, they feared me. If they feared me, they stayed." He let out a hollow breath. "Turns out, they still stayed away." Elijah shifted slightly. "Power keeps people close," he said. Careful wording. "But it doesn't keep them honest." Richard closed his eyes. Memories rushed in, assistants smiling too quickly, friends agreeing too easily, family calls unanswered. "When I fell," Richard said, trembling, "they watched." His throat tightened. "You stayed." Elijah's shoulders lifted and fell with a breath. "I know what the ground feels like," he said again. A nurse entered briefly to check vitals. She smiled at Elijah and left, closing the door gently. Richard noticed the smile. "She doesn't smile at me like that," he said. Elijah smiled faintly. "She sees you now," he replied. "Is that a good thing?" Richard asked. "It's a real thing," Elijah said. Richard nodded slowly. He shifted, wincing slightly. Elijah noticed and reached for the water without being asked. "Thank you," Richard said. They sat for a moment, the sunlight moving across the wall. "I offered you money," Richard said, self-aware reflection. "You refused." Elijah nodded. "Why?" Richard asked again, softer this time. "Because if I took it," Elijah replied, measured response, "you might think the debt was paid." Richard's brow furrowed. "And it isn't?" "No," Elijah said gently. Kind firmness. "You're still here." The words cut and healed at the same time. Richard felt tears gather again. He did not turn away this time. "What do I do with that?" Richard asked, pleading uncertainty. Elijah leaned back slightly, giving space. "You listen," he said, steady advice. "Not just to me, to the people you pass every day." Richard nodded. "And then?" "You choose," Elijah replied, empowering tone. "I don't know how to be small," Richard admitted. Humble confession. Elijah smiled, not unkindly. "Start with being present." A knock sounded at the door. A head of security peeked in. "Sir, visiting hours." "Later," Richard said, firm but calm. The guard nodded and withdrew. Richard turned back to Elijah. "Stay," he said again. Earnest request. "For a bit," Elijah agreed, conditional acceptance. They spoke quietly as afternoon faded. Elijah talked about the community kitchen, about names and faces Richard had never known. Richard listened, really listened. At one point, Richard laughed softly at a small story Elijah told, then stopped, surprised at himself. "I haven't laughed like that in years," he said. Elijah's eyes warmed. As evening shadows stretched, Richard felt tired but lighter. "I don't want to go back to how it was," he said, resolute intent. "You don't have to," Elijah replied, assuring confidence. Richard reached out, hesitated, then rested his hand on the bed rail, careful movement. "Will you come back tomorrow?" he asked, hopeful request. Elijah considered, then nodded, sincere agreement. As Elijah stood to leave, Richard watched him go with a feeling he couldn't name, new emotion, not dependence, not fear, something steadier. As the door closed, Richard leaned back against the pillows, settling. The room felt smaller, warmer. Comfort found. For the first time, the thought of tomorrow did not feel like a burden. The next morning arrived slowly, wrapped in a pale gray light that made the hospital room feel suspended between night and day. Richard Hale lay awake long before the nurse came in, staring at the wall, replaying every word from the conversation he had shared with Elijah the day before. For the first time in years, his mind was not filled with numbers, schedules, or deals. It was filled with faces, faces he had passed, ignored, forgotten. A soft knock broke his thoughts. The nurse entered with a warm smile. "You slept better," she observed. "I didn't sleep much," Richard admitted. She adjusted the IV and checked the monitor. "Your vitals look stronger today." Richard nodded but said nothing. His eyes kept drifting toward the door. "You're expecting someone," the nurse said gently. "Yes," Richard replied quickly. She smiled again and stepped out. Minutes passed. Each one stretched longer than the last. Richard felt an unfamiliar nervousness settle in his chest. He had hosted presidents, negotiated with rivals, and commanded rooms full of powerful people, but this felt different. Then the door opened. Elijah stepped inside, holding a small paper cup of coffee and a folded napkin. Richard's face softened instantly. "You came," he said. "I said I would," Elijah replied simply. Richard gestured to the chair. "Please." Elijah sat, placing the coffee carefully on the side table. They sat in silence for a moment. It was not awkward. It felt earned. "I kept thinking about what you said," Richard began, "about being on the ground." Elijah nodded slightly. "I've been surrounded by help my whole life," Richard continued. "But yesterday was the first time someone helped me without wanting anything back." Elijah looked down briefly. Richard reached toward the bedside drawer with effort. He pulled out a thick envelope and placed it on the table between them. Elijah's eyes flicked to it, then back to Richard. "There's money in there," Richard said plainly. "Enough to change your life." Elijah did not touch it. "I want you to take it," Richard added. "Not as payment, as gratitude." Elijah exhaled slowly. "I can't," he said. Richard's brow tightened. "Why not?" "Because you'll think we're even," Elijah replied. The words hit Richard harder than expected. "We're not?" Richard asked quietly. Elijah met his eyes. "This isn't about even," he said. "It's about what happens next." Richard leaned back against the pillows. His chest felt tight, not from pain, but from truth. "All my life," Richard said slowly, "I believed money was the answer to every problem." He let out a short, humorless laugh. "Turns out it's just how I avoided them." Elijah listened without interruption. "When I offered you money yesterday," Richard continued, "I thought I was being generous." His voice dropped. "Now I see I was trying to protect myself." Elijah nodded once. "From what?" Richard asked. "From feeling," Elijah replied gently. Silence filled the room again. Richard's eyes burned. He blinked hard but did not look away this time. "I don't know how to live without hiding behind it," Richard said, fragilely. Elijah leaned back slightly, choosing his words. "Then don't change everything at once," he said, steady guidance. "Just don't use it to end a conversation." Richard absorbed that slowly. "What do you need?" Richard asked suddenly. "Me?" Elijah looked surprised. "Yes," Richard said, earnestly. "Not what I think you need, what you actually need." Elijah considered. "I need stability," he said carefully. "I need to know where I'll sleep. I need work that doesn't break my body." Richard nodded, listening closely. "And I need dignity," added Elijah. Richard felt something inside him shift again. "Then let me do this differently," Richard said. He slid the envelope back into the drawer. "No gifts," he continued. "No secrets. If I help, it will be openly, fairly." Elijah studied him. "And if you don't?" Elijah asked testingly. "Then you walk away," Richard replied, honestly. The room grew quiet. Elijah finally nodded. "That's different." "I'm trying to be," Richard said. A faint smile crossed Elijah's face. Later, a doctor entered to review progress. Richard answered politely, but kept glancing at Elijah. When the doctor left, Richard spoke again. "Will you tell me if I'm doing it wrong?" Elijah smiled slightly. "I think you'll feel it." Richard let out a soft breath. As afternoon light filled the room, they talked, not about money, not about rescue, but about small things. Weather, books, the quiet strength it takes to keep showing up. For Richard, it felt like learning a new language. When Elijah stood to leave, Richard spoke quickly. "Come back tomorrow?" Elijah paused. "I will," he said. As the door closed behind him, Richard lay back and stared at the ceiling. For the first time, the idea of help no longer felt like control. It felt like responsibility, and he knew he could not turn away from it now. The day Richard left the hospital arrived quietly, without celebration or cameras. Morning light spilled across the hallway floors as nurses moved with practiced calm. Richard sat at the edge of the bed, shoes in hand, feeling older and lighter at the same time. His body was still weak, but something inside him felt awake. A nurse checked his chart and smiled. "Take it slow," she said. "I will," Richard replied. When the door opened again, Elijah stood there, hands folded, eyes steady. "You ready?" Elijah asked. Richard nodded, then paused. "I think so," he said. Security waited down the hall, respectful but alert. Richard noticed how they kept space now, not crowding him. He took his first steps forward, each one measured. The hallway felt longer than before. Outside, the air felt colder and sharper. Richard drew a careful breath. The city noise returned. Horns, footsteps, distant voices. It all sounded louder than he remembered. Elijah gestured toward the street. "This way," he said. They walked together, side by side, not speaking at first. Richard noticed how people looked at Elijah. Some nodded, some smiled, some stopped to talk. They barely glanced at Richard. Instead of stinging, it felt grounding. The community kitchen stood between a laundromat and a closed bookstore. Its sign was faded. The door creaked as Elijah pushed it open. Worn air and the smell of soup drifted out. Inside, volunteers moved with quiet purpose. Pots simmered, tables were wiped, laughter rose and fell. Richard froze just inside the door. No one rushed to greet him. No one recognized him. Elijah set his jacket on a hook. "Grab an apron," he said. Richard blinked. "Me?" Elijah nodded. Richard hesitated, then reached for an apron. His hands trembled as he tied it. He felt ridiculous and strangely right. A woman at the stove glanced over. "New volunteer?" she asked. Richard opened his mouth, then closed it. "Yes," he said finally. She smiled and handed him a stack of bowls. "Start there," she said. Richard carried the bowls to the counter, careful not to drop them. The work was simple, repetitive, real. With each movement, his breathing steadied. Elijah worked nearby, chopping vegetables. "You okay?" he asked. Richard nodded. "I am," he said. People began to arrive, faces tired, shoulders hunched, eyes cautious. Elijah greeted them by name. Richard watched, absorbing the ease of it. An older man approached the counter. "Afternoon," he said. Richard looked up, unsure. "Soup's hot," Elijah said. passing a bowl. Richard followed, handing bread across the counter. The man smiled. "Thanks," he said. Richard felt a tightness in his throat. "You're welcome," he replied. More people came, more bowls, more bread. Richard lost track of time. His back ached, his hands warmed. He felt present in a way he hadn't in years. A woman laughed at something Elijah said. A child tugged at her sleeve. Richard smiled without thinking, then stopped, surprised. During a lull, Elijah leaned closer. "How does it feel?" Richard searched for words. "Honest," he said. Elijah nodded. "Come back tomorrow," he said. Richard didn't answer right away. Then he nodded. "I will," he said. As the afternoon ended, they cleaned together. Tables wiped, floors swept. The kitchen grew quiet again. Outside, the sky dimmed. Richard leaned against the wall, tired. Elijah handed him a bottle of water. "Thank you," Richard said. "For what?" Elijah asked. "For letting me be here," Richard replied. Elijah studied him. "This isn't mine to give," he said. "You showed up." Richard nodded. A car pulled up at the curb, his driver waiting patiently. Richard glanced at it, then back at the kitchen. "I'll see you tomorrow," Richard said. Elijah smiled faintly. "Tomorrow," he echoed. As the car pulled away, Richard watched the building recede. His body ached, his heart felt full. He rested his head back against the seat. For the first time, the city outside didn't look like something to conquer. It looked like something to belong to. The next morning arrived with a quiet calm, the kind that carries the weight of possibility. Richard Hale awoke earlier than usual, sunlight spilling through the curtains in slanted beams across his hospital room. He had slept poorly the night before, yet for the first time in years he felt restless, not anxious, but alert, as if the world was waiting for him to step into it. Elijah was already there when he opened his eyes, standing near the window with his hands folded and a small, determined look in his eyes. "Morning," he said softly. Richard managed a faint smile. "Morning," he replied, his voice still hoarse from disuse. The room felt smaller somehow, less sterile, as if Elijah's presence had left traces of warmth behind. Richard swung his legs over the side of the bed, wincing as his joints reminded him of his age and weakness. "You ready?" Elijah asked, nodding toward the door. Richard nodded firmly this time. "I think so," he said, his tone carrying the weight of commitment. Outside, the air was crisp with the faint smell of wet pavement from last night's rain. Richard drew a slow, deliberate breath. The city around them was awakening. Footsteps echoed, distant engines roared, and vendors began setting up their morning stalls. When they reached the community kitchen, the small space was already buzzing with volunteers and early arrivals. Pots clanged, conversations murmured, and the smell of freshly baked bread mingled with simmering soup. Elijah turned to Richard with a small, meaningful look. "You ready?" he asked. Richard took a deep breath and nodded. "Yes," he said, though his hands trembled slightly as he reached for an apron. He tied it slowly, feeling awkward yet oddly empowered. Elijah chuckled softly at his hesitation, and Richard smiled despite himself. "Come on," Elijah said, leading him to a counter piled with vegetables and bowls. Richard followed, chopping vegetables under Elijah's watchful eye. Each slice felt deliberate, grounding him in the moment. He noticed small details, the smoothness of a carrot, the weight of a knife, the sound of the chopping against the cutting board. A young girl approached, timidly holding a bowl. "Can you help me?" she asked softly. Richard looked at her, then at Elijah. "Of course," he said, kneeling slightly to her level. Together they filled the bowl with soup, their movements careful and synchronized. The girl smiled up at him, her small eyes full of genuine gratitude. Richard felt something stir in his chest, a mix of pride, humility, and a sudden sharp awareness of how disconnected he had been from such moments all his life. Elijah worked nearby, chopping and organizing, occasionally offering guidance but never criticism. Richard watched him, noticing how effortlessly he connected with everyone, volunteers, children, even the quiet regulars who often came for a hot meal. As the morning progressed, more people arrived. Richard moved between tasks, washing dishes, stirring pots, handing out bread. The work was repetitive, yet with each small action, he felt a growing sense of purpose. A man in his late 60s approached, holding a worn coat and a tattered bag. "Afternoon," he said with a raspy voice. Richard looked up and handed him a bowl of soup without thinking. The man's eyes glimmered with quiet appreciation. "Thank you, sir," he said. Richard felt a lump in his throat. For the first time in decades, he felt the weight of a simple act of giving, not as a transaction, not as a performance, but as an unspoken connection between human beings. Elijah noticed Richard's reaction and gave him a subtle nod. He didn't speak, he didn't need to. The understanding was mutual. By midday, the kitchen was humming like a well-oiled machine. Richard had settled into a rhythm, moving with purpose, yet absorbing every detail around him. He noticed the exhaustion on volunteers' faces, the joy in small gestures, and the silent camaraderie that bound everyone together. During a brief pause, Elijah handed him a glass of water. Richard drank slowly, feeling the cool liquid soothe his throat and steady his mind. "You're doing well," Elijah said quietly. Richard smiled faintly. "Feels different," he admitted. "Different good?" Elijah asked with a slight tilt of his head. "Yes," Richard said firmly. "It's real." As the afternoon wore on, a child tugged at Richard's sleeve asking for help with a small stack of plates. He laughed softly, the sound unfamiliar and warm. Together they carried the plates to the serving counter, Elijah following close behind. More volunteers began sharing stories, laughing and exchanging advice. Richard listened, occasionally joining in, realizing that connection didn't require grandeur or influence, just presence. Later, Elijah pulled him aside, motioning to a small garden behind the kitchen. "You ready for the next part?" he asked. Richard raised an eyebrow. "Next part?" "The garden, fresh vegetables. We could use your help planting," Elijah said with a faint smile. Richard hesitated, then nodded. Outside, the air was warmer now, carrying the scent of soil and greenery. Richard dug into the earth with his hands, feeling the cool, damp soil slip through his fingers. Each seed he planted felt like a promise, a small gesture that could grow into something larger than himself. Elijah worked beside him, guiding but never commanding. "You're a quick learner," Elijah said quietly. Richard chuckled softly. "I just don't want to mess it up," he replied, humbly. As they worked, Richard realized he had never felt this kind of satisfaction before, not from a deal, not from a title, not from a signature. Each planted seed, each stirred pot, each small act of service reminded him of the humanity he had long ignored. By late afternoon, the garden was neat and the kitchen quieted. Volunteers lingered, cleaning up and sharing light conversation. Richard stood back, brushing dirt from his hands and surveying the day's work. Elijah clapped him gently on the shoulder. "Not bad for a first day," he said. Richard looked at him and smiled, a real, unguarded smile. "Not bad at all," he echoed. As they walked toward the door, Richard felt a sense of anticipation for tomorrow, a feeling he hadn't experienced in decades. The city outside seemed less intimidating now, less about power and more about life, connection, and responsibility. When Elijah stepped aside to let him leave, Richard paused. "Tomorrow," he said softly. Elijah smiled faintly. "Tomorrow," he repeated. Richard left the kitchen with his hands in his pockets, heart steady and mind clearer than it had been in years. For the first time he understood that change wasn't about grand gestures or headlines. It was about showing up consistently and giving without expectation. For the first time, Richard Hale was not just surviving, he was starting to live. The following morning, the city was alive in a way that felt almost celebratory, though no one was aware of it except Richard Hale. The sun rose slowly, brushing the streets with soft gold light, casting long shadows of people hurrying to their destinations. Richard stepped out of his apartment building, walking with Elijah beside him, and felt the city pulse under his feet. It was strange to him how alive it felt, not with opportunity for power or business, but with life itself. The traffic, the conversations, the distant laughter of children, it all seemed to carry a rhythm he had ignored for decades. "You ready?" Elijah asked quietly, glancing at him. Richard nodded, taking a deep breath. "I think so," he said, more confident this time. They arrived at the community kitchen, the familiar building now bathed in morning light. Volunteers were already bustling about, chopping vegetables, arranging bread, setting tables. The smell of coffee, freshly baked bread, and simmering soup greeted them. Richard inhaled deeply, feeling alive in a way he hadn't in years. "Good morning, Mr. Hale," one of the regular volunteers greeted, smiling warmly. Richard blinked, momentarily surprised, then returned the smile. "Good morning," he replied. Elijah leaned close and whispered, "Jump in, don't overthink it." Richard nodded and tied on an apron. The fabric felt heavy in his hands, but grounding at the same time. The morning began with familiar tasks: chopping vegetables, stirring pots, arranging plates. Each movement was deliberate and measured, yet comforting. Richard realized he was not thinking about deals, profits, or investments, just about the task in front of him. A group of children arrived, led by a young woman from the shelter. Richard noticed how cautious they were, eyes wide, fingers gripping the edges of bowls or coats. He knelt down to one small boy, handing him a bowl of soup with both hands. "Here," he said softly. The boy's eyes widened with surprise, then softened as he accepted it. "Thank you," the boy whispered. Richard felt a tightness in his chest. He nodded gently, unable to find words at first. Elijah watched from across the room, a faint smile on his face. He did not intervene, only observed. Throughout the morning, Richard moved seamlessly between tasks. He handed out bread to the elderly, poured soup for the hungry, and helped wash dishes without complaint. Each small action carried a weight of meaning he hadn't known existed before. A woman approached him with a small bundle of clothing. "Could you help me fold these?" she asked. Richard nodded, smiling gently. "Of course," he said. As he worked, he began to notice details he had long ignored: the way the sunlight fell through the kitchen windows, the soft hum of conversation, the laughter that erupted unexpectedly from a corner of the room. He realized that life wasn't just about surviving or thriving in a world of power. It was about presence, connection, and small acts of care. By midday, the kitchen was full of activity. Volunteers coordinated efficiently, guiding newcomers and sharing tasks. Richard found himself moving naturally through the space, giving instructions where needed, but never asserting dominance. During a brief lull, Elijah handed him a glass of water. "You're doing well," he said quietly. Richard drank slowly, feeling the cool liquid steady his body and mind. "Feels different," Richard admitted softly. "Different good?" Elijah asked with a slight tilt of his head. "Yes," Richard said firmly. "It's real." As the afternoon continued, they moved to the small garden behind the kitchen. Richard dug into the soil, planting seeds with care, feeling the earth crumble and settle in his hands. Each seed represented a small act, a quiet promise of growth, patience, and life. Elijah worked beside him, guiding but never controlling. "You're learning fast," he said quietly. Richard smiled, a little embarrassed. "I just want to get it right," he said. The garden became a metaphor for Richard himself, a life that needed care, attention, and patience to grow. Every seed, every turn of soil, every small act of nurturing reminded him that he could change, not overnight, but steadily. More people arrived as evening approached. Children laughed and played near the garden, volunteers shared stories, and the kitchen buzzed with the satisfaction of a day well spent. Richard moved among them, helping, listening, and engaging with a humility he had never known before. When the work ended, Elijah pulled him aside. "Tomorrow will be even busier," he said. Richard nodded. "I'm ready," he said with quiet confidence. As they walked back through the city streets towards his car, Richard felt a shift in himself he could not fully explain. The city no longer felt intimidating, cold, or transactional. It felt alive, connected, and full of small opportunities to do good. When Richard entered his car, he leaned back in the seat, exhausted but profoundly satisfied. For the first time, he understood that living was not about control, wealth, or power. It was about showing up, being present, and giving without expectation. Elijah nodded from the sidewalk. "Tomorrow," he said softly, a silent promise of continuity. Richard smiled, feeling a rare, unguarded warmth spread through him. "Tomorrow," he echoed. As the car pulled away, Richard looked back at the community kitchen, at the people he had met, at the hands he had helped, and felt a sense of belonging he had never known in all his years of wealth and influence. For the first time, Richard Hale realized that life's true measure was not found in money, titles, or control. It was found in the quiet impact of a simple act done with sincerity, over and over again. He closed his eyes as the city sped past, letting the day's experiences sink in. Tomorrow would come, and he would be ready to face it, not as a billionaire seeking power, but as a man beginning to understand the power of giving. And in that quiet realization, Richard felt something he had long thought impossible: hope. Genuine, steady, and alive. The following morning, the city was awake in a way that seemed almost celebratory, though no one outside the small circle of Richard Hale and Elijah would have noticed. Sunlight spilled through the streets in slanted, golden rays, glinting off glass buildings and puddles left by an overnight rain. The air was crisp, carrying the faint scent of wet asphalt and the smell of fresh bread from nearby bakeries. Richard walked beside Elijah, each step deliberate, feeling a rhythm in his body that he had not experienced in decades. For the first time, the city seemed alive not with the pulse of commerce or the promise of power, but with life itself, its unpredictable, messy, vibrant life. The distant laughter of children, the shouts of street vendors, the hum of traffic, it all felt tangible, immediate, and oddly personal. "You ready?" Elijah asked quietly, glancing at him with a faint smile. Richard nodded, taking a deep, steadying breath. "I think so," he replied, more confident than he had in years. They arrived at the community kitchen, now bathed in morning light. Volunteers bustled about with purpose, chopping vegetables, arranging bread, and setting up tables for the day's visitors. The smell of coffee mingled with simmering soup and fresh bread, creating an aroma that Richard realized had become comfortingly familiar. "Good morning, Mr. Hale," called a young volunteer, smiling warmly. Richard blinked in surprise, then returned the smile, feeling a strange sense of belonging. "Good morning," he replied. Elijah leaned close, his voice barely above a whisper. "Jump in. Don't overthink it." Richard tied on his apron, feeling the fabric heavy and grounding in his hands. He looked around the room, taking in the organized chaos of preparation, noticing small details, the way sunlight streamed through the windows, the soft laughter from the corner, the careful hands of volunteers as they moved with precision and care. The day began with simple tasks: chopping vegetables, stirring soups, arranging bowls. Each motion was deliberate, grounding him in the present moment. Richard's mind was quiet. No spreadsheets, no boardrooms, no high-stakes deals, only the work in front of him and the people around him. A small boy approached the counter timidly, holding out a cup. Richard knelt down, smiling gently. "Here," he said softly, handing him soup. The boy's eyes lit up with surprise and gratitude. "Thank you, sir," the boy whispered. Richard felt a lump in his throat, a tightness he had not expected. This simple act, the handing of a bowl, carried weight far beyond what he had ever experienced from power, money, or authority. Elijah watched from across the room, his eyes quietly approving. There was no need for words, the silent affirmation was enough. As the morning wore on, more people arrived. Richard moved seamlessly from task to task, pouring soup, handing out bread, washing dishes, and engaging with visitors with genuine attention. Each act reinforced a new rhythm within him, a pattern of connection that he had long ignored. During a brief pause, Elijah handed him a glass of water. "You're doing well," he said quietly. Richard drank, feeling the cool liquid steady him, and nodded. "Feels different," he admitted. "Different good?" Elijah asked with a slight tilt of his head. "Yes," Richard said firmly. "It's real." Later, they moved to the small garden behind the kitchen. Richard dug into the soil, planting seeds with care. Each seed represented not just growth in the garden, but growth within himself, a commitment to patience, nurturing, and presence. Elijah worked alongside him, guiding but never commanding. "You're learning quickly," he said quietly. Richard chuckled softly, embarrassed. "I just don't want to mess it up," he replied. As they planted, Richard began to notice how the garden mirrored his own life: neglected areas, small beginnings, but the potential for flourishing if given consistent care. Every seed he planted was a quiet promise to himself that he could change, not immediately, not perfectly, but steadily. The afternoon brought more arrivals, children laughing, volunteers sharing stories, visitors arriving for meals. Richard engaged naturally, helping wherever needed, listening, learning, and offering his attention with genuine focus. He realized that real connection was not about power or status, but presence and sincerity. During a brief lull, Elijah pulled him aside. "Tomorrow will be even busier," he said. Richard nodded. "I'm ready," he said with a quiet confidence. When the day's work ended, Richard took a moment to stand back and look at the community kitchen and the garden. Volunteers cleaned, dishes were stacked, tables wiped, and the garden watered and orderly. The satisfaction of a day well spent filled him with a warmth he had never felt from his previous life of wealth and power. Elijah clapped him lightly on the shoulder. "Not bad for a first week," he said softly. Richard smiled genuinely, a full, unguarded smile. "Not bad at all," he echoed. As they walked back towards the car, Richard felt a shift within himself, a sense of purpose, connection, and hope that he had never known despite a lifetime of material success. The city no longer intimidated him. It felt alive, full of opportunities to engage and contribute in ways that mattered. When Richard entered the car, he leaned back in his seat, exhausted yet profoundly satisfied. Elijah nodded from the sidewalk. "Tomorrow," he said softly, a silent promise of continuity. Richard smiled, feeling a rare warmth spread through him. "Tomorrow," he echoed. As the car drove away, Richard looked back at the community kitchen, at the people he had helped, and at the hands he had touched. He realized that life's true measure was not wealth, status, or influence, but the quiet impact of consistent, sincere acts of care. For the first time, Richard Hale understood the meaning of purpose, not in headlines, not in recognition, but in showing up, being present, and giving without expectation. As the city sped past, Richard closed his eyes, letting the day's experiences sink in. He felt alive, fully present, and ready to face each tomorrow not as a billionaire trying to control the world, but as a man learning to live fully and honestly. In that quiet moment, a feeling he had thought impossible filled him. Hope, steady, real, and undeniable. Richard smiled to himself, finally understanding that one simple act of kindness, given without thought of reward, could change not only the life of the recipient, but the giver as well. And as the car disappeared into the hum of the city, he knew he would never see the world or himself the same way again.